They were outnumbered, outgunned, and no one at Supreme Headquarters believed they could hold. The snow was falling at minus 11 degrees Celsius in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, and 3 German armies were tearing through the Allied lines like a battering ram through wet paper. What happened next in those frozen foxholes along Elsenborn Ridge would decide the entire Western Front, and almost nobody alive today knows their names. Welcome to W2 Silent Valor, the channel that tells the stories history forgot to remember. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that doesn't show up in Hollywood films or mainstream documentaries. Stay with us. It was the 19th of December, 1944. 3 days had passed since the German offensive shattered the Ghost Front. The temperature sat at minus 11 Celsius. Snow buried the foxholes along Elsenborn Ridge in Belgium's Ardennes forest, and the soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division, barely a month in this sector green by any measure, had already absorbed 3 days of the heaviest German armored assault on the Western Front since Normandy. To their south, entire American regiments had ceased to exist as fighting formations. The 106th Infantry Division had lost 2 complete regiments in the SHAEF. 7,000 to 9,000 men captured in a single catastrophic reversal, the worst single defeat suffered by American arms in the entire European theater. And inside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the map tables were telling a story that every general in the room could see, but no one wanted to say out loud. The German penetration had done something that no one had believed possible even 48 hours earlier. It had severed communications between Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg and the 2 armies fighting on the northern side of the breakthrough, General Hodge's 1st Army and General Simpson's 9th Army. Bradley had not seen either army commander since the battle began. He had not issued a single directive on which they could act. His armies were fighting blind, responding to immediate pressure without any coherent picture of the battle as a whole. The northern shoulder had not yet been destroyed, but no one at Supreme Headquarters could say with any confidence how long that would remain true. To understand why all of this mattered, you have to go back to Hitler's plan, and more importantly, to why his own generals believed it was madness. The operation was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The name had been chosen deliberately to mislead Allied signals intelligence into believing it was a defensive operation. It was not defensive in any sense. 3 German armies, 200,000 men, 600 tanks were to strike through the Ardennes at its weakest point, cross the Meuse River within 96 hours, and drive northwest to Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies completely in 2, cutting off and destroying 4 Allied armies, and forcing a negotiated peace that would free Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviets in the east. Field Marshal Model, who would command the offensive, believed the plan carried perhaps a 10% chance of success. He said so directly to Hitler. Hitler ignored him and ordered the attack to proceed exactly as he had designed it. What strikes you when you trace the German planning documents is not the ambition, though the ambition is staggering enough. It is the absolute, unforgiving dependency on timetable. Model's own analysis made clear that if the Germans did not cross the Meuse within 4 days, the offensive would fail. The Allies would bring up reserves. The roads through the Ardennes would become clogged with stalled vehicles and broken equipment. The Sixth Panzer Army's fuel supply, already dangerously thin before the first shot was fired, would not support a prolonged advance. The entire plan was, at its core, a sprint disguised as a campaign. And that sprint required one thing above everything else: clear roads running northwest. Those roads ran through Elsenborn Ridge. The Ardennes sector had earned its nickname, honestly. The Ghost Front, they called it. Quiet, thinly held, an area where exhausted divisions came to recover and green divisions came to learn their trade before being moved to harder sectors. In mid-November 1944, the 99th Infantry Division had relieved the veteran 9th Infantry Division across a front that the 9th had held with fewer troops than the 99th was now trying to cover. The result was 3 regiments stretched across 22 miles with no reserve, a front so thin it existed on paper more than on the ground. Allied intelligence had not been blind. Through November and into early December, signals had accumulated. Radio intercepts, agent reports, aerial reconnaissance made difficult by the persistent overcast weather that also, not coincidentally, grounded Allied air power. The picture was there. It existed scattered across individual reports, sitting in different offices on different desks, processed by different analysts who never assembled them into a single coherent assessment. The governing assumption was that Germany was too weakened, too depleted in men and armor and fuel to mount a major offensive anywhere. The Ardennes was the last place anyone expected one. That assumption cost thousands of men their lives. On the 11th of December, 5 days before the offensive opened, General Gero, commanding the 5th Corps, recognized that the gap between his corps and Troy Middleton's 8th Corps to the south was essentially undefended. Patrolled only by jeep, held by almost nothing, he reported it up the chain of command. Gap was noted. Nothing was done. 5 days later, at 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of December, 1944, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along a 100-mile front. The conventional narrative of Montgomery and the Battle of the Bulge almost always begins on the 20th of December, when Eisenhower formally transferred command of the northern shoulder to the British Field Marshal. What that narrative consistently misses, what World War II silent valor exists to tell you, is what happened in the 3 days before Montgomery arrived, and why those 3 days determined the outcome of the entire battle. On the morning of the 17th of December, Major General Walter Robertson of the 2nd Infantry Division received orders to pull his division back from its attack toward the Roer River dams and execute a withdrawal under fire to Krinkelt-Roscherath, twin villages 7.5 miles to the southwest. The 2nd Division was in contact with the enemy. It was daylight, visibility was poor. The 12th SS Panzer Division was pressing from the east. Robertson devised what he called a skin-the-cat maneuver, lead battalions retreating through reserve battalions in alternating sequence, each unit protecting the movement of the next. Under fire, in snow, against one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, it worked. By the 18th of December, the 2nd and 99th Divisions had consolidated on Elsenborn Ridge itself, a long elevated plateau commanding the entire road network to the west. The ridge was artillery country. By the 19th of December, over 300 guns had been registered on the approaches below. 155 millimeter, 105 millimeter, 75 millimeter chemical mortars concentrated wheel to wheel in the valley below, covering every route the Germans needed to use. What followed was not a battle in any dramatic, cinematic sense. It was methodical, industrial destruction. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth, one of the Wehrmacht's most feared formations, attacked the ridge 3 times. 3 times it was shredded by massed American artillery. By the 26th of December, the 12th SS had broken itself against Elsenborn Ridge. It would be transferred to the Eastern Front on the 16th of January, effectively annihilated as a fighting force. It never posed a serious threat to the Western Front again. Montgomery was given command of the Northern Shoulder on the 20th of December. The Northern Shoulder had already been anchored before he arrived. Eisenhower's decision that morning was driven by operational logic, not by personal preference. Bradley's headquarters was in Luxembourg City, on the southern side of the German breakthrough. With the Bulge now 60 miles wide, his communications with Hodges and Simpson on the northern side were not degraded. They were gone. Neither Army commander had received a directive from their Army Group commander since the 16th of December. They were fighting without orders, reacting to immediate tactical pressure with no picture of the battle as a whole. Montgomery was north of the breakthrough. He had communications, he had his own headquarters staff, and he had British 30th Corps, veteran formations that had fought from Normandy to the Dutch border available as a reserve that could be moved to block the Meuse crossings if the German advance continued westward. The transfer of 1st Army and Ninth Army to Montgomery's 21st Army Group was announced in an official SHAEF communique carefully drafted to make clear this reflected no failure on the part of any American general. That sentence required considerable care in its drafting. Omar Bradley read the announcement in Luxembourg and understood immediately what the American press and public would make of it. He was not wrong. He had spent years building a reputation as the soldier's general, the commander who understood American fighting men. Having his armies placed under a British Field Marshal, regardless of the operational logic, would read as a verdict on American performance. Bradley would spend the next decade of his life writing the American counter-narrative. Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters on the 20th of December. His own description of what he found is worth examining carefully. He described the northern flank as disorganized. Neither Hodges nor Simpson had seen Bradley or any senior member of his staff since the battle began. They had no directive. They were operating on improvisation and instinct. What Montgomery found was not, however, a disaster in progress. The units at Elsenborn were fighting and holding. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, 80 tanks and 4,000 men, had penetrated 60 miles into the American rear, but had outrun its fuel supply and been blocked at the crossroads of Stoumont and L'Église. German momentum was slowing, constrained by terrain, by fuel, and by the resistance that the maps in Versailles hadn't fully captured. What the Northern Front lacked was not soldiers willing to fight. It was coordination. Someone to determine who was responsible for which sector, where the reserves were, what the plan was if the Germans attempted to cross the Meuse. Montgomery provided this. He visited both army commanders in person, something Bradley had not done since the battle began. He positioned British 30th Corps along the Meuse as insurance. He reorganized the defensive line, pulling some units back to shorten and strengthen it. He designated Joe Collins' 7th Corps as the reserve for the eventual counterattack. The question that would consume 60 years of military historiography is whether these contributions counted as saving the battle or managing a situation that American soldiers had already fundamentally stabilized at enormous cost. That question does not have a clean answer, but the operational record makes one thing clear. The ridge was held before he arrived. While all of this was unfolding in the north, something was happening in the south that would capture the American imagination entirely and permanently reshape how the Battle of the Bulge was remembered. On the 19th of December, Eisenhower had convened a conference at Verdun. The mood in the room was bleak. Then George Patton walked in. He assessed the situation, surveyed the map, and told Eisenhower he could attack north from Luxembourg with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. No army in the history of modern warfare turns 90 degrees and launches a major offensive in 48 hours. The men present considered it somewhere between impossible and insane. Patton had already ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans before he walked into the conference. He made one phone call from Verdun. 3rd Army began turning north. On the 26th of December, the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve reached Bastogne, breaking the encirclement of the 101st Airborne Division. The image of Patton's relief column punching through to the surrounded paratroopers, the rescue, the drama, the sheer audacity of speed, became the American story of the Bulge, the northern shoulder where the German offensive had actually broken its back against Elsenborn Ridge, where Robertson's 2nd Division had executed one of the most tactically difficult withdrawals of the entire war, where 300 guns had destroyed the Hitler Youth Division in place over 10 days of grinding defensive combat, received comparatively little coverage. There was no single dramatic moment, no rescue, no defiant one-word response to a surrender demand, just 10 days of methodical, lethal, freezing defense by soldiers most people have never heard of. History remembered Bastogne. The ridge that made Bastogne survivable was largely forgotten. The friction between Montgomery and the American commanders was not simply a matter of personality, though personality certainly made it worse. It expressed a genuine and deep difference in military doctrine that ran through the entire Northwest Europe campaign. Montgomery's method was the set-piece battle: prepare the ground, establish the supply line, concentrate the artillery, attack only when conditions favor success. He had rebuilt the Eighth Army in North Africa on this principle, and it had worked. El Alamein was a set-piece battle. Normandy's breakout came after weeks of grinding attrition that drew German armor onto the British front. The method was slow, cautious, and when correctly applied, reliable. The American method was different in philosophy: decentralized initiative, speed over preparation, accept friction, and push through it, rather than wait for it to resolve. Patton embodied this most visibly, but it ran through the entire culture of the American Army by 1944. From Eisenhower's resistance to Montgomery's single thrust strategy down to the company commanders improvising solutions in frozen woods rather than waiting for orders that weren't coming. Neither doctrine was wrong. Both had produced victories. The tension between them was structural, inevitable, and in the context of a coalition alliance, politically explosive every time it surfaced. Montgomery's delay of the northern counterattack until the 3rd of January, while Patton was already fighting hard in the South, was doctrinally correct by his own standards. Collins' 7th Corps needed to be properly assembled and positioned. The ground needed to be firm. But the American commanders, watching from the South, experienced it as hesitation, as excessive caution, as a man who had been handed command of their armies and was moving at a pace they found professionally and personally maddening. The battle for historical credit began before the German withdrawal was complete. Montgomery's press conference on the 7th of January, 1945, was the opening move, and it was a decisive one. The German offensive had been contained. The counterattack from the north was underway. The crisis was over. Montgomery spoke for nearly an hour without notes. He praised Eisenhower. He praised the American soldiers, describing them as fighting with great courage under terrible conditions. The substance of what he said was largely accurate. The tone was something else entirely. He described the battle in terms of his own decisions: the reorganization, the defensive consolidation, the deliberate delay of the counterattack until conditions were right. He used framing that implied the situation had been chaotic before his arrival and orderly after it. He didn't say this directly, he didn't need to. The assembled correspondents heard exactly what the framing implied. The headline that ran in American newspapers on the 8th of January, when SHAEF finally lifted the news blackout on the command change, read, "Montgomery leads Yanks." The follow-up coverage after the press conference hardened the impression into something approaching conventional wisdom, that a British field marshal had arrived to rescue disorganized American armies that couldn't manage their own battle. Bradley read the transcripts in Luxembourg and by his own later account came as close as he ever had to resigning his command. Eisenhower drafted a letter to the combined chiefs proposing that either he or Montgomery be relieved. Churchill had to personally intervene to prevent the alliance from fracturing over a press conference, stripping away the command politics, stripping away the memoirs written years later by men with reputations to protect. The operational record of what actually halted the German offensive is less ambiguous than the historiography suggests. The northern shoulder held because of 3 things that had nothing to do with Montgomery's arrival on the 20th of December. First, Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, reinforced by the 1st Infantry Division from the 17th of December onward, denied the 6th Panzer Army its main axis of advance. Without the roads through Elsenborn, Sepp Dietrich's army could not reach Liège. Without Liège, the advance to Antwerp was logistically impossible from the moment the ridge held. The ridge held before Montgomery took command. Second, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most dangerous single German formation in the offensive, 80 tanks and 4,000 men had penetrated 60 miles into the American rear before running out of fuel near L'Église. On the 23rd of December, Peiper's column was blocked, surrounded, and eventually destroyed by American forces who had no directive from any army group. Commander and improvised their response entirely from the ground up. Third, German logistics. The entire offensive had been planned around capturing American fuel dumps along the route of advance. American commanders improvising without orders destroyed or denied those dumps before the Germans could reach them. Without fuel, the German armor stopped. These three things ended the German offensive. Montgomery organized the counterattack. He stabilized the command structure. Both were real contributions to the ultimate Allied victory. But by the time he arrived, the battle's outcome had already been determined in frozen foxholes on a Belgian ridgeline by soldiers whose names history never bothered to remember. Churchill addressed the House of Commons on the 18th of January, 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge was winding toward its conclusion. He chose his words with visible care. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale, he said, not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. It was the most diplomatically precise sentence of his entire war premiership. It acknowledged the narrative problem. It acknowledged that the battle was, at its core, an American battle. It drew a line without conceding that Montgomery's role had been overstated, because Churchill would not say that publicly. But the line was there, and everyone in the House of Commons understood exactly why it needed to be drawn. The question the story poses has a more complicated answer than either side wanted to give. Did Montgomery save the northern shoulder, or did he arrive after the hardest work was done and claim the credit that belonged to others? The honest answer is, he did not save the northern shoulder. The 2nd Infantry Division saved it, beginning on the 17th of December, 3 days before Montgomery took command. The 99th Infantry Division saved it by absorbing the initial German shock. Without breaking, 5,000 American casualties in the Elsenborn sector saved it. What Montgomery provided was something real, but far less dramatic than his press conference implied, a functioning command structure at a moment when the structure had fractured. He organized the counterattack. He positioned the reserve. He brought professional order to headquarters operating on improvisation. These were genuine contributions. They were not the same as winning the battle. The moment that decided who would be remembered as the savior of the northern shoulder did not happen on the frozen slopes of Elsenborn Ridge. It happened on the 7th of January, 1945, in a press room in Belgium, before an audience of correspondents who had no way of knowing everything that had happened before Montgomery arrived. History went to the press conference. The men who had actually broken the German offensive were still in their foxholes, cold, exhausted, and almost entirely unaware that a different battle, a battle over their stories, had already begun without them. This is what a WW, Two Silent Valor, exists for. The soldiers of the 2nd Division, the men of the 99th, the artillery crews who stood their guns in minus 11 degrees and fired until the 12th SS ran out of men to send forward. These are the stories that deserve to be told. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Montgomery has been given too much credit, or did he contribute more than the American narrative admits? We read every comment. And if you want more stories like this, the forgotten battles, the unrecognized soldiers, the history that never made it into the textbooks, subscribe to WW, Two Silent Valor. There's so much more still to tell.